All right, so to get into the title race, we have the Athletics Arsenal writer James McNicholas. We've also got Merseyside football writer Simon Hughes, and a man who splits his time between both writing for Manchester City and Manchester United. Some might say lucky or unlucky, depending on which way you're looking at it. We've got Mark Critchley as well. Right, gents, let's get into this. I guess it's something to be celebrated, really, that we are truly in what feels like a three-horse race in the Premier League at this moment in time. I think there's a piece that's just dropped by Jacob Whitehead on the Athletic today that basically states that the last time both teams finished 5 points of each other was 10 years ago, 2013-14 season. A certain Jose Mourinho was still at Chelsea. A certain Steven Gerrard managed to slip at a vital moment in a match for Liverpool. Let's start with you on this one, Critch. Manchester City, are they looking like all guns blazing to win the Premier League, or does it generally feel like there's some serious jeopardy right now?
Well, I think I've been on enough podcasts on this podcast enough times as well over the past year where we've talked about how can anyone compete with City? Has the Premier League become the Bundesliga? Is the future a sky blue boot stamping on the face of English football forever, etc., etc. And I know a lot of City fans don't like those arguments, but I honestly I kind of subscribe to them. I think when you pull the camera back and you look at like five titles out of six in the last few years, three 90-point finishes. They've been the dominant team over this period, even though Liverpool have run them close. And Liverpool, look, they've had one of the greatest managers in their history. Behind the scenes, they run the club almost perfectly, and they've only walked away with one title. So I think that speaks to City's pedigree and the fact that you can just never discount them. We've had periods in each of those seasons, I think, where City haven't quite looked all guns blazing, as you say, but they're kind of like they're like a you know like somebody like in a horror film when somebody's buried underground and you think they're dead and buried, and then suddenly like a fist raises up out the ground and grabs you by the ankle and pulls you back in. That's what City do. So I think at the moment perhaps they're not at the tip top form. If you look at I think they've only scored 11 in the last six, only three in the last three. Perhaps not quite as impressive as we used to seeing, but we know what they do. They go on these runs. They win game after game after game, and pull themselves back in front. And so I think while it perhaps doesn't look totally ominous for Liverpool and Arsenal at the minute, you absolutely can't discount City's pedigree in this.
Yeah, Simon, I'm just thinking about the storyline of the Premier League and what this means, really. You've got Klopp leaving, you've got Guardiola trying to outdo everyone in terms of, accolades and, trying to break records. But does it feel like something is romantic happening at Liverpool this season, in many respects? Let's forget the Gerrard slip 10 years ago.
You had to throw that one in, didn't you? Early as well. I think that the big thing at the moment, Liverpool, is the injury situation above everything else. I mean, the teams that win the titles tend to be the ones that remain injury free for the longest and manage to have availability at the key times. Obviously, City had their injury problems early on in the season. Liverpool, I mean, if Liverpool win the league from this position, they've got 12 players out at the moment. It's like a few years ago, you're saying, well, if Salah's out, they're going to struggle. They've got 12 players out. So, and certainly it's already been confirmed that I think Alisson Becker, Curtis Jones, Trent Alexander-Arnold, they're not going to be playing in March. So that's three, top class players who are going to be unavailable in a period where Liverpool are playing some of the closest rivals, both in terms of competitiveness, Man City, and then in terms of geography, Everton. So for Liverpool, if Liverpool win the league from this position, I think it will be an astonishing achievement. I'm not saying that they can't, because, as you said, there's a certain level of sort of magic when you throw Klopp into the mix with this. I mean, I don't think any other team would have won the League Cup or the Carabao Cup from the position that Liverpool won a couple of days ago, and that gives people the belief that maybe something incredible could happen. You say incredible, Liverpool are top of the league, and they have been for some time, and it sort of feels like, well, Liverpool have got everything to lose, but I actually think the pressure's right off Liverpool at the moment because of the injuries, because they won the League Cup. And anything else that happens from here is a bonus. You've got to be realistic. 12 injuries, it's very difficult to deal with that. Almost impossible, I would say.
James, Mikel Arteta I guess in terms of experience, the least experienced out of the two managers we've just spoken about. But defensively, Arsenal have been incredible this season, top of the bill when it comes to defensive, it being a defensive fortress, but also outscoring City this season as well, which is quite impressive.
Yeah, they've been flying since they came back from Dubai in January. They've been a good defensive team all season long, but obviously the goals just dried up for them at the turn of the year. But yeah, they came out the blocks really strong and they can't stop scoring right now. And it's interesting, talking about them in the context of the title race, it's impossible not to talk about last season. I think all Arsenal fans bear the scars of last season to a certain extent. So I almost think there's a bit of a hesitance to really sort of jump on board the kind of title train too early. I think, we've been burned by that before. But I think in some ways it might suit Arsenal, maybe being kind of the outsiders at this point in time. A lot of the focus is inevitably on Liverpool because of Klopp and his departure, inevitably on City because, well, they are so inevitable. And Arsenal, maybe a little bit less talk around them right now. And I think that could be a good thing because, going under the radar might suit this team, this young team, as they look to do this for the first time, which would be a massive, massive achievement for them.
Yeah, for sure. Critch, we can't ignore Pep Guardiola. I call him the Thanos of managing. if we look at it, we're using the Avengers analogy, but realistically, he's a manager with an insane work ethic, but also a manager that seems to get the best out of his team just when it matters as well.
Yeah, look, I think if we want to talk about the difference, that the reason why that City have been so dominant over the past few years, look, I'm sure plenty of people have a lot of different opinions on that, right? And we could go into hour-long podcasts on FFP, state ownership, whatever. You can't really separate the fact that Guardiola is at the club from that debate either. But all that being said, are they as dominant as they have been if he's not there? I think fundamentally most people would agree no. And you're right. The one thing that I think separates Guardiola from just about every other, every single one of his peers is problem solving. That's fundamentally what management is, right? But he will always come up with an idea or a tactical system or just something that people haven't really hadn't thought of before. And when he's the first to do it, others follow. So, does another manager move John Stones into midfield last season and turn City's fortunes around and tilt them towards the title? Probably not. There's been countless other examples in the past of similar things that he's done. Just when it looks like, they basically play without a left back for 5 years. I'm still waiting for him to sign on the proper one. So, like, when you have somebody who's capable of that, it almost immunizes you from all the different setbacks that can come along the way in a title race. And I think from that perspective, he's always been their biggest strength in it. And look, like I say, I think what everybody can agree on really is that the day that he leaves, City will be much weaker for it. And that'll be the time when other clubs will look to take advantage of that. But until, for as long as he remains in the dugout, he's absolutely a huge reason of why they're always going to be favourites in a race like this.
Yeah. Simon, just thinking about players in general, if you move away from managers, I mean, all three teams are stacked with incredible players, injuries aside. Liverpool are really fascinating because I think what's been great to see from Liverpool is a team that can still operate without Mo Salah, who next to Haaland is, top scorer in the Premier League this season. We talk about problem solving from Guardiola, sorry. From a Klopp perspective, he has to be commended for the way he's managed to make this team work. Darwin Núñez, we've seen as a player who seems to have grown in confidence as the season has gone on. Do you think Liverpool have enough decisive players right now to push for that for the Premier League?
Well, the players that they're going to have to trust over the next couple of weeks are untested players largely. You've obviously done well in the cup final and then last night in the FA Cup. I mean, it's interesting what Critch says. I think Guardiola's strength is sort of the micromanagement of games and situations, whereas Klopp's sort of approach to the tactical elements of the game has evolved over the years, but it doesn't change very often over a short period of time. And I think, people talk about identity in football all the time. I think what we're seeing now in Liverpool's first team with the young players coming from the academy is that they know exactly what's expected of them because of the imprint that Klopp has right across the club in terms of the expectations on the players. So Bobby Clark, for example, obviously very talented technical player, but I think what impressed me most in the Carabao Cup final was tactically he knew exactly what was expected of him because there's certain expectations of playing in that role in midfield, whether you're playing for the first team or the under-23s or lower. So it's allowing a lot of these players, it's making it more straightforward for some of these younger players to come in and have an impact. Going into a title race, I would think, obviously they've had two amazing results. I would say last night, Southampton is an incredible result. I know they're a championship team, but to feel a number of sort of largely untested players and win as convincingly as they did will encourage a lot of Liverpool fans, I guess. But, they're coming up against some really top quality opposition over the next few weeks, teams that are going to be confident as well. So that's going to be a real test. So I think, Liverpool can afford maybe to have some of these players absent for a couple of games, but it can't really go on for much longer. I think the reality of the situation will hit Liverpool hard. That's not me being, negative. It's just the reality of it. If as I said earlier, if they were to win the title with this number of players out for over, out for over a period of more than a fortnight, it's going to be an enormous achievement. Arguably one of the greatest achievements ever, I would say, because I think people now in football just think, well, he's injured, somebody else can just come in. It's like, it's not as straightforward as that, particularly when you're dealing with young players. There is an argument as well that Liverpool, could Liverpool have done more to ensure that these players aren't injured? This is not me saying, oh, poor old Liverpool, that they're dealing with lots of injuries, not of their own making. That there is an argument. There's a lot of conversation at the moment about like sort of what the club is doing internally to ensure that players don't become injured. To have 12 injuries is a pretty spectacular number, I would say. Obviously, some of those have happened in games when you've been, bad tackle or something that can happen, can't it? But when it's repeated muscle injuries, you have to start sort of asking a few questions of what the club is doing as well.
James, in terms of tactically and being fluid, Mikel Arteta has to be given some plaudits. No recognisable number 9, really. Jesus hasn't really been in the team that much this season. And when he has played, he's been effective, but he's been in and out. Yet they're still scoring, especially in the second half of this season. We have to talk about that, as well as that defensive solidity, as to where Arsenal are at this moment in time.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's been the way for Arsenal since the start of last season that they've really shared the goals around. It's interesting that the number 9 conversation has become such a big theme when we're only, a few years removed from City winning the league without a recognised striker. I think it's eminently possible if you're getting those goals from elsewhere in the team, which Arsenal are doing right now, particularly Bukayo Saka. He is just in absolutely sensational form. But, injuries will be a factor for them too. They were a factor last season. The loss of William Saliba and Takahiro Tomiyasu in the same game as Europa League game, which they went out against Sporting Lisbon. I think that played a huge part in the title bid coming off the rails. And Arsenal have worked really hard to ensure that they've got not just more depth, but maybe more physically reliable players within the squad as well. We've seen some issues still with Jesus struggling for fitness. Thomas Partey's been out, but they've managed to cope with that relatively well thus far. And I think what's going to be interesting is the next few weeks in particular. They have got a significantly lighter schedule than some of these other teams. I mean, I think I'm right in saying Liverpool play 6 games in March. For Arsenal, it's just 3 Premier League games and their Champions League tie. That could make quite a big difference in terms of getting into those final couple of months, April and May, in decent shape.
Yeah, for sure. Critch, yesterday we were talking about Haaland and De Bruyne, how just, I don't know, it feels like deja vu, but they're back at the right time. We can't ignore the telepathy of that partnership, can we? And just how well that suits City at this moment in time, especially at a time where they're needing to show their superiority in the league.
Yeah, I mean, the performance at Luton the other night was just extraordinary, really. Like you say, that connection, that telepathy, and it's something that City been missing for most of the season. Obviously, De Bruyne getting injured in the opening game against Burnley, and Haaland's had his periods, his spells out too. He's still got 17 goals in the league. He was still the top scorer for all that period. which, you know, in a down year, you have to say still pretty remarkable. You know, I think what City have done since Haaland's come in, just picking up on James's point there, yeah, they won the league a few years ago without a recognised number 9. You know, just adding Erling Haaland into this team was never a given that it was going to work, really. I know it sounds ridiculous when he scores the number of goals and performs at the level that he did, but it still required a recalibration. It's still been quite, you know, a bit of a sea change, really, in just how City play. You've got this guy who's got 17 goals this season. The next highest in the squad is Foden with 9. You know, so really they're now operating with a focal point, with a talisman, if you like. So that has been difficult, and you know, having him out the side again this season and having to readapt and then go back to the plan A and plan B and whatever. That's perhaps been more of a challenge, and perhaps is why you haven't actually seen City at absolutely their fluid best. But when all those players come back together, I mean, you've got De Bruyne back now, Haaland back. I think the return of John Stones as well, if he can stay fit, that is huge as well. He started 3 games in a row now, and just what he does and how he's even taken up even more advanced positions than we saw last season now. Those 3 and others, Rodri, of course, we might come on to. They're all just absolutely essential players, but City have got them all back at the right time, and that can only be worrying for the other 2 teams in the race.
Yeah, before we move on, I just want to quickly talk about summer business. James, especially around Declan Rice, Havertz, Jorginho, Trossard, and what impact they've made on the squad. You know, someone was talking about these youngsters just being able to come on for Liverpool and feel like they fit into the system. You could arguably say a player like Trossard, for instance, and Declan Rice seem to have really understood what Arteta wants, and actually that in turn is also a huge credit for the recruitment in general.
Yeah, it was a big factor actually when they were looking at Trossard. Obviously, it was last January. Mykhailo Mudryk was the #1 target, and when they lost out on him to Chelsea, they pivoted to Trossard. And one of the most attractive things about him was that he played in a similar game model at Brighton. One of the coaching staff as well had worked with him in Belgium, and he felt that he'd be able to adapt very quickly to Mikel Arteta's demands. And it proved to be the case. I mean, he had a really strong finish to the season. He's continued that form into this. Declan Rice, I think it took him a little bit more time to acclimatise. I think the level of detail and instruction that he was getting from Arteta was new to him. He was having to learn to play kind of a multifunctional role. You know, at times he's almost playing an auxiliary centre-half. At other times he's in the opponent's half, leading the press. There's a lot to take in. But it's a credit to him how swiftly he's adapted, and he's been incredibly important for Arsenal this season. And you have to think, you know, if they are to go on and win something in what remains of the campaign, he's going to be absolutely at the heart of it.
Yeah, Simon, talk about injuries, but you also have to give credit to the rebuilding of Liverpool's midfield, right? Like Endo, Gravenberch, some really key players, McAllister as well. What would you have made of Liverpool's recruitment this summer?
Well, it was a departure from what had served them well in the past, really. I think that's important to remember that Jörg Schmadeke came in, you know, sort of early summer with the remit of basically following Jürgen Klopp's instructions, really. So, I mean, it's been interesting watching the analysis of sort of exactly what happens. I mean, the reality is Liverpool signed Dominic Szoboszlai after engaging in his release clause. Alexis McAllister, that deal was done by Schmadeke's predecessor, Julian Ward, having again engaged the release clause. So there's not a great deal of negotiation around that, certainly with the clubs, you know what I mean? They just engaged the release clause and then had to deal with the players' demands. Endo is the one I'd say, which was very left field, that nobody would have ever spoken about as being, you know, he fits the profile of being a Liverpool player. Obviously, back end of his 20s, given a long contract. I must say, I was a bit surprised by the length of that contract. But he has become, he's played a crucial role over the last couple of, certainly since Christmas and before as well. He's really knuckled down, and I think you saw that at Wembley on Sunday. You know, when he was up against, well, certainly one of the players who would have come to Liverpool had they been able to get him. You know, Liverpool were really keen on signing Caicedo. I thought that Endo won that battle. He's been a really good signing for the team, and the fact that he's been able to settle into that sort of deep midfield role. It's allowed McAllister to play a bit more advanced and express himself a little bit more without having to worry so much about what goes on behind him, and that suits him. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure whether Liverpool had this sort of really well thought out strategy for the summer, but it's worked. You know, they did need that change in midfield. The back end of last season, you know, that was the area where they really struggled. I mean, I've got to say, they got 40 million for Fabinho, who has been a brilliant player for Liverpool. But to get 40 million for a player and make a profit on a player whose best years are way behind him, I'd say there's a stroke of fortune that that Liverpool were able to profit from that Saudi investment at the time. You know, that allowed Liverpool to go and spend some of the money that they did on the players that I've already mentioned. So within that as well, I think you've got to mention Curtis Jones. I think Curtis Jones has been brilliant for Liverpool this season. He's really kicked on. It's a real shame for him that he's missing out this period, because I'd actually argue he's probably been the most consistent of all the midfielders when he's played. When he's come into the team, he's just sort of settled back in straight away, knows what his tactical responsibilities are. He's expressing himself more, creating more chances, scoring more goals. And that area of the pitch has become, when the players are available anyway, for Liverpool now.
Yeah. Rich, very quickly before we move on, we have to talk about City's, I guess, more January signings, really, in terms of Nunes, Kovacic as well. Is it a luxury to not be able to bed those players in like immediately? Because Guardiola's used them quite sparsely, but how important do you think they're going to be for this title push?
I feel like the signings that City made last summer were kind of look, losing Gundogan was huge. I think I think people kind of underestimated just how much he really tied things together in the midfield and gave City that element of control. We always talk about this with Guardiola players, that he wants players who are able to keep possession, who are able to slow the game down, who are able to make the right passes at the right time, because it's all about total domination and suffocating opponents, and that's what Gundogan did. And I think, look, if you look at Kovacic and Nunes as Gundogan replacements, have they managed to step up to that level? Perhaps not quite yet. I think Kovacic had a bright start, but faded slightly. I think, you know, James will definitely remember the game at Arsenal in October when he a lot of people thought he should have got sent off, to be honest, and he had to be brought off because he really wasn't up to the standard that day. It's been difficult for him, but I think there's been signs of greater adaptation since then. Nunes, I think he's still trying to find his role, still trying to find a position in this team, and we've seen that with Guardiola signings in the past, that it often takes a season or two for them to really kick on. And I think that's probably going to be the case for both of them. But you can't really say that. Well, look, City perhaps aren't having as dominant the season as they have in the past, but they're still in it and they're still in the hunt. And like we keep saying, that it still feels like they'll inevitably go on one of these runs. So it hasn't detracted too much, but I do think Gundogan has been something of a miss and something that those two players haven't quite lived up to just yet.
Well, let's move on to the fixtures. March looking like an intense month in general. James sort of alluded to it earlier in terms of Arsenal potentially having a semi-easier run in general. But I mean, James, no game is easy in the Premier League. But do you think Arsenal will benefit from perhaps only having to? I mean, they're two very big competitions. Let's not face it, the Champions League and the Premier League. But it looks Liverpool and City are the only two within that three that still got an FA Cup draws.
Yes, and Liverpool, you know, going for a quadruple, aren't they? And Arsenal know very well that a Europa League schedule can be quite draining. It's a lot of fixtures to win that competition. And Liverpool will be going for it. You know, Klopp will be going for it, I'm sure. Arsenal's schedule is a little bit lighter in March, but I don't want to downplay it. They've got some away games in the run-in where historically they have really struggled. I mean, the Etihad, that one at the end of March, looks absolutely massive, but they've also got a North London derby at Spurs. They've got to go to Old Trafford, who might not be in the best of form necessarily in terms of their performance level, but at Old Trafford, their record against Arsenal is pretty good. You know, this is not going to be straightforward for Arsenal, and they've been accumulating points pretty impressively in the last few weeks. But I think with the exception of Liverpool, they have played some pretty poor teams. I'd say some of the poorer teams in the league along the way. So it's a real litmus test. And I think that City game at the end of March is absolutely huge. You know, Arsenal have got such a dismal record there. And to be honest with you, my gut feeling is that if Arsenal are to win this league, they might have to get a result in that fixture.
Really, you think it goes down to that one against Pep Guardiola to really stamp a sense of authority?
I think it could make a real difference. I mean, obviously, Arsenal beat City at home. They beat Liverpool at home. They got a point against Liverpool away that was pretty valuable for them. I think losing to City would just sort of could trigger a collapse in a similar way to last season. I think that it's really important. If you look historically at Arsenal's famous title wins, there have been some pretty significant away wins along the way at places like Old Trafford, White Hart Lane. They're going to need to do something like that again, I think, if they're going to kind of keep up this pace and hold off two teams. That's the thing about this race. It's all right being a race with one, but here effectively looking for two others to slip up. I think it is that much more challenging.
James, very quickly, Simon, I'm going to come to you about the quadruple in just a second, because with this team and the injuries, who knows? But in terms of the mental strength, or maybe they've built more mental strength or resilience, is probably the better word, from Arsenal. Do you think you've seen enough of that perhaps a game like Porto, which might have derailed this team last season, they're able to kick back, as we've seen in the Newcastle game at home?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, historically with this young team, we have seen that kind of one bad result can quickly become two or three. And I was really impressed by how they bounced back against Newcastle. What I'm fascinated to discover over the next couple of months is to what extent Mikel Arteta has kind of engineered this team to peak at the right time. I mean, that was the big learning from last season, where Arsenal absolutely flew out the blocks. I think surprising even people at Arsenal, to be honest, with the rate of points they were picking up, and then couldn't quite sustain it. In the first half of this season, Arsenal accumulated plenty of points, but they weren't playing their best football. And the likes of Havertz, were still settling into the team. David Raya still settling into the team. Now they seem to be coming on really strong at the right time. That's something Guardiola's been an absolute master at. And maybe Arteta's learned one or two lessons there. I also think Arsenal have shown patience with some of the players coming back from injury. So the likes of Jesus, the likes of Jurrien Timber, who's back on the training pitch now, Thomas Partey. I think maybe last season these guys would have been rushed back in. There might have been a bit of a desperation there to get them back on the field. Whereas I get the sense that right now, Arsenal are really, really taking their time to ensure that they are as strong as possible in those final few fixtures.
Simon, talk to me. Quadruple. What are we saying?
Well, I suppose the benefit that Liverpool have is, first of all, the manager has been through this challenge before. I don't want to keep going about injuries, but it is the reality. If you've got all these players injured, it's impossible to. It's going to be very hard to win one of those trophies. Never mind four, I would say. I mean, ordinarily, I would imagine that he would like to mix the team up for the away leg in Prague next week, but it's now going to have to be largely the same players playing in the Europa League, then in the Premier League on the Sunday, and then in the FA Cup as well. There isn't that flexibility with selection at the moment to be able to freshen the team up, unless, of course, we see, I mean, the most likely players to return at the earliest point would, I guess, would be Salah, Szoboszlai and Nunes. I suspect that the manager wants to get those players fit for the City game at Anfield. I mean, that game is enormous, really. And the thing is, I would always back Liverpool at home against any opponent, really, no matter the circumstances, really. And to some strange extent, I think that Liverpool having a few players missing will ignite the crowd even more and want to get on City's backs even more than they would usually. Manchester City's record at Anfield under Guardiola isn't good, but there's no clubs that could say that their record at Anfield under Klopp is good. So that's nothing to be ashamed of. I think the only game that they won at Anfield was in the COVID season when there were no fans there. So, and I think when Guardiola talks about Anfield and the power of the crowd in these big games, okay, I accept, in the games where Liverpool are expected to win, it's not as energetic. But in these sorts of games where it's a big game, where there's a sense of rivalry, a sense of Liverpool being a little bit of the underdog, given all the injuries that they've got to deal with. It's not going to be comfortable for City, I would say, unless they can score a couple of early goals, maybe, which they haven't done before. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I mean, I've got to say, if Jurgen Klopp manages to navigate his way through this period, everything that we've said about him as a manager, you know, I think we've actually underplayed it, because I can't think of any. I can't think of any example in modern European football history where they're having to deal with this challenge. You know, a quadruple, one of the biggest, you know, challenges there is in football, whilst having a lot of absentees. I'm just boring myself talking about all these injuries, but it's just the reality of it, isn't it? You can't ignore it. It's there. And if he manages to find a way to get a tune out of players who are untested in the most difficult, pressurized points of the season, you know, I think James mentioned before, the two injuries that had a massive impact on our Arsenal season. Liverpool have got that now, you know, times 5. You know, so it's going to be hard. But I would always back Klopp to come up with at least a fighting solution that gives Liverpool a chance of getting through it. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating. I'm really looking forward to all these sort of subplots. It's not just a clear run at the moment, is it? I think all the teams are dealing with slightly different situations, which makes it really interesting.
Yeah, Critch, we're so used to City leading the way in this respect. Liverpool have obviously pipped them to it, the league in the past. But does that add to that element of jeopardy? Arsenal still to come to the Etihad, City still to go to Anfield. I mean, what would have seen maybe last season or this couple of seasons ago as okay games, let's maybe get a draw here, a win. Literally, it has to be a win. There is no need, or there's no way either of these teams can slip up at this moment in time.
Yeah, no, look, I think the fact that we're doing this podcast now from a City perspective is it's like ideal timing, because from Sunday onwards, you've got probably, look, put the Champions League to one side. This is probably the month where City's Premier League title defence will be decided. They've got United at home, Liverpool away, Brighton away, Arsenal at home, Villa at home. And if you look just those 5 games that I don't think any team would particularly fancy, those are going to decide it. And you're right, look, Liverpool and Arsenal both played each other twice this season, right? So you don't have a weekend where you know one of those teams is going to drop points. City, you have to play them both. I think, is it must win? Look, I think kind of if City can get through this month and they're still behind, but they're only behind, let's say they're within a margin of 3 of whoever's leading, then for everything that we've talked about already on this podcast, for the pedigree, for the dominance over the years, for the fact that you know that they go on these runs, and are they going to go on one of these runs, that their breath will be felt on the back of whoever's next in front, right? So that to come within that margin at the end of this period will be key. I don't think they necessarily have to win, but I do think they definitely can't lose either of those games, because if they lose either of them, that really hands momentum to one of the rivals at a key point of the season. And like we keep saying, City's almost the joker in City's pack is momentum, right? It's this idea that they can just go on this spin and they'll just keep going. And if you hand that over to one of the other rivals at this point, I think that could be dangerous. But look, once they get through this, I think after that, to be totally honest, it's a lot of, apart from Tottenham away, they've still got to go to Tottenham, and they've got traditionally a pretty historic poor record there. They've already won there this season in the cup, but before that, it was a bit of a wasteland for them. Aside from that, they're all games you'd expect them to win, and you can see one of those runs coming. And so it's about getting through this month now.
Yeah, James, very quickly on the Arsenal, and very different circumstances. Maybe not this time of this season, but if we talk about before January, Arsenal were actually, some might say, overachieving last season, especially the opening half of the season. This time they are really in the chasing pack on a psychological level. Can that also be beneficial for this team?
Yeah, as I said, I think going under the radar may suit them a little bit more. I don't think you could downplay the psychological impact of those big games. I don't want to bang on about that City match, but if I think back to last season, Arsenal were in a very strong position when City came to the Emirates. City got the win, and I think it had a huge psychological weight in the remainder of the title race. I think that's partly why it's so important Arsenal try and avoid defeat at the Etihad when that game comes up. But, you know, at this point in time, 26 games in, Arsenal have got the same number of points as they did from the equivalent fixtures last season. And Arsenal's season last season was almost a tale of two campaigns, really. It was one that was very good up until March, and then one where they were really poor. You know, their form, their underlying metrics were those of a mid-table side, effectively. So it's about consistency. It's about stamina. Can they maintain this with the psychological pressures ramping up? And they're the ones who haven't done it before. And I do think that makes it so much tougher for them. But it also guarantees that there is enormous hunger and desire and drive to do it. So I don't think they're going to be lacking motivation. It's just a question of how they manage and how they cope when the heat's really turned up.
Right. I want to finish on this, and it's a bit of a hypothetical, but I was talking to producer Guy about this just before we came on the pod in terms of obviously this month, well, March is going to be intense, right? They're all playing each other and there's some amazing games, but is there an air that because they are so competitive and because all three are quite evenly killed at this moment in time that we don't see them maybe in a playoff, for instance? You know, let's take the championship model. Let's take an American model. Let's maybe take, you know, a rugby model and bring it into this. Si, what do you reckon? A fully fit Liverpool taking on a fully fit Manchester City and Arsenal in a three-way playoff. What we saying?
No. Just a simple answer. Not everything has to change all of the time. No.
You don't, not at all.
No, I don't think it needs a debate. I'm sure it'd be like popular amongst some of the American owners who would like that spectacle, but it just, I don't know, it just takes away, I think, from the actual challenge of trying to win the league. It's like one of the, you know, it's as a lot of teams have found out, it's very hard to win the league. So say Arsenal won the league, having not won it for so long, and then suddenly actually you haven't won the league, you've got to play a playoff. Imagine that, how you would feel. It's just not for me, though. You know, no, I just don't think it benefits anybody other than people who want to make money out of the game.
Yeah, I think it's like, because it's a bad idea, it'll probably happen at some point. Like someone will probably think, "Oh, this is all right." But it's, you know, we have a tradition in English football where, you know, it's you play everybody twice, home and away, and then whoever's the best and gets the most points out of that wins. And I think that's fair enough. And look, speaking as, I know you mentioned the championship model, I think, look, the playoffs in the championship are brilliant. They're like brilliant viewing every season, but that is between third and sixth. And if you're the third place team, sorry, if the sixth place team gets promoted to the Premier League and the third place team doesn't, I guess there's an injustice there, but we're not talking about the same level of injustice as if you finish top of the top flight after a 38 game season, again, beat home and away, you've got the most points and you don't win the league. I think that is a fundamental, and this wouldn't even call it a tradition. It's a principle of English football that should probably be protected. And yeah, look, I actually support a team in the National League North. We're third at the minute, and you don't even get automatic promotion if you're second. And I'm pissed off about that. Like, that doesn't feel fair to me. You know, second, and that's in a division where you the whole objective is to try and climb higher and to move up the leagues. Never mind, like, be the ultimate, you know, the champions of England. So yeah, I think let's not do it. But I can imagine a time when somebody has that bright idea, yes, and it gets implemented.
Well, you never know. We might get
yeah.
a Manchester City versus Arsenal playoff at Wembley, but it'd be for the Champions League, not the Premier League.
Yeah, that's what that's for at the end. That works.
So you're not buying it, James? The Premier League playoffs? No.
No, I think Mark makes a good point about the Championship. I think I could see a plausible future in which maybe one of the European qualification places is decided via those means. I can see that those games would be big money spinners, big viewing figures, and you know, so I can sort of sense maybe a bit of inevitability about that. But when it comes to the league itself, you know, it's a marathon, and it's about who finishes that marathon and who finishes in first place. I think to take that away would really diminish the value of the competition, and I don't see it happening. You know, we are fundamentally still quite traditionalist about our football, and I think that element of it will definitely be retained.
Right, let's end it there. James, Mark, Simon, really appreciate your time. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast. And Michael Bailey will be with you with the weekend preview tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, click subscribe for more content like this. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season to bring you the inside track to the biggest stories in football. If you'd like to listen to the full episodes for free, search the Athletic Football Podcast wherever you get your podcasts from.